Hey people, in this video I would like to explain to you how to best set up your double pedal on the drum kit. We will mainly focus on the positioning and symmetrical settings. This is an excerpt from a longer video on the basics of pedal setup. So here we don't talk about how spring tension, beater angle and so on affect the feeling and performance of your pedal. If you still want to know more about these basics, then you can watch the whole video here, and in the description you will find the link to a bonus PDF with a summary table of the best settings for different styles of playing and music genres. But if you just want to know how to best position and evenly adjust your double pedal, you've come to the right place, and we'll get into it right away. Basically, of course, the same principles apply to two pedals as to a single bass drum pedal, but there are a few more aspects. If you have two single pedals and two bass drums, you just set both pedals exactly the same. But even this rule is not set in stone. Our legs are never 100% symmetrical or equally strong, if only because we move them differently on the bass drum and the hi-hat and thus train them differently. It can therefore also make sense to set them up a little differently. For example, I have a slightly higher spring tension on the left than on the right pedal. Speaking of symmetrical, here I would like to mention a very typical mistake again. If you see drummers with two bass drums, they are almost always symmetrical. Both are at the same angle towards the audience. That's just logical. You face the audience, so your legs point slightly to the left and to the right. But that also means that if you play with just one bass drum and a double pedal, we would have to sit in exactly the same position, meaning the bass drum is not facing the audience, but is at a slight angle. For visual reasons, however, most drummers position the bass drum in such a way that the resonant head aligns with the edge of the drum riser. As long as you're aware that you're sitting at a slight angle to the audience, that's not a problem. Unfortunately, many then sit twisted. The upper body faces forward, but the lower half of the body points to the side. Then you have asymmetrical strains, which can be unhealthy, and you don't play as evenly anymore. Symmetry isn't always the solution, but it should be your starting point. So when setting up, make sure that the upper and lower body are in one line as much as possible. If your legs aren't that far apart, then this factor doesn't matter as much because your feet are almost parallel. Symmetry is also the starting point when it comes to how the beaters hit the head. If you want the strokes to sound as identical as possible, the beater heads should hit exactly the same distance to the left and to the right from the center of the bass drum head. Unfortunately, this is not possible with every pedal. Sometimes the clamp only attaches in such a way that the main beater hits exactly in the middle, then the other one is offset by quite a bit, and you hear that, and it also feels differently. If you only use the double pedal occasionally and play mainly with one foot on the bass drum, it doesn't matter. And if you use triggers or heavily compress the sound, it's hardly noticeable in the sound, but still in the performance of the pedals. So if consistency is important to you, you should switch to a pedal that gives you this option. The basic settings of the two pedals should of course also be about the same, so make sure that both beaters have the same angle to the head and that the cams on both sides have the same position, otherwise they will feel quite differently. The angle of the footplate should also be roughly the same, but here you can make an exception for two reasons. It can make sense to adjust the pedal that transmits the beater via the shaft, the so-called slave pedal, so that it has the same angle as the hi-hat pedal. In addition, the angle of the beater and the footplate can also be slightly larger if you often switch back and forth between the bass drum and the hi-hat, because then you have less time to wind up for a stroke where the beater normally would swing back a bit and gain more energy. The larger angle compensates for this missing lever. And another factor that is often neglected is the spacing between the two pedals, which you can adjust here on the shaft. And also make sure that all these screws are tight, because you can see here, if I don't tighten these screws, you have a lot of play here, and this also applies to the screws which attach to the axle here. Make sure that you are in the correct position, usually it's flattened on one side, and that you really tighten them. The spacing for a big part is determined by what other pedals you use. If you play a lot on the hi-hat, maybe the spacing might be a little smaller. If you prefer to play mostly on the double pedal and you need it pretty wide, there are also hi-hat pedals which give you the option to be placed inside this double pedal. And also take the flexibility of your hips into account. Some prefer to have this very close because they can just move more comfortably in that position. So don't forget this factor, it can have a huge influence, and keep in mind the further apart both pedals are, the bigger the angle of the pedals should be to follow the natural angle of your legs. So we see it is very important to consider what exactly you want to use your pedal for. This of course also applies when it comes to fine-tuning. You already know quite a bit about which parameters you can adjust and how, for example, to play faster, have more power or play with more control. Depending on your goal, you then adjust both pedals and then test them. But we also have to consider that we cannot always transfer the settings for a single pedal directly to the double pedal. Because we play with both feet, we move a little differently and can no longer support ourselves on one foot. Here too it is very important to make a hypothesis as to how the pedal should be adjusted and then test it extensively under real conditions. So play what you want to play with it. As already mentioned, it is best to always have the same test procedures so that you can compare the settings. Go through all the tempos and techniques. This will prevent you from slipping straight into a tempo that works well with that setting and just stay in that sweet spot. You want to make it comparable. Therefore, you need an objective test procedure. And once you've found a good setting, give yourself time here too. So try it out for several days so that you get used to the new adjustments. Often the advantages only become apparent after a little time. And also, always be ready to make small adjustments. Feel free to use the table in the bonus PDF or the tips from the first half to find your perfect pedal settings. A cool tip here, by the way. If you really want to set both pedals the same, there is a way to bring the spring tension to the same value very quickly and precisely. If the beater angle and weight, as well as the position of the cam, is set on both pedals exactly the same and one of the pedals has the ideal spring tension, then you put two identical dumbbell weights on the same exact position on the pedal. If it slips, just put a piece of rubber underneath. And then you change the spring tension so that one pedal moves closer to the other. If the beater is closer to the head, then increase the tension. If it is further away, then decrease it. Tap the pedal slightly in between to see where it levels off. If both end up in exactly the same starting position, most of the time the playing feel will end up being pretty much the same on both pedals. If you don't have weights, use something that fits comfortably on the pedal and is exactly the same weight, like a juice box. If all other parameters are set exactly the same beforehand, you can fine-tune it pretty well with this method and end up with both pedals swinging exactly the same a few times when you tap them. This doesn't have to be perfect and can never be exactly the same with a double pedal because of the transmission via the drive shaft, but they shouldn't behave completely differently if they are to feel the same under your feet in the end. If you still can't get both pedals to behave the same way, then have a look and see if there's play in the joints of the shaft because the moving parts are worn out. This is quite common and unfortunately has a very large impact on pedal performance and hinders faster playing. Hold the cam of the slave pedal and then see if you can move the beater on the other side. If this is the case, first make sure that all the screws are actually tight. If it's still moving, you should replace this part. Incidentally, ACD Unlimited also offers upgrades here, because this shaft is a weak point in some foot pedals, and so you can significantly improve the performance of your pedal and get a lot out of a cheap foot pedal. So far for a few basic tips on setting up and adjusting your double pedal. Feel free to check the link in the description for the whole foot technique series. There are many more tips on how to set up and maintain your pedals, but above all on playing technique from the absolute basics to special techniques, balance training and so on. See you there, take care and bye bye.